So we were discussing the formation of states in the Western Hemisphere, particularly the United States. So and some of the origins, the constitution, the revolutions, the reasons for the colonists wanting independence, and we agree that taxation was a significant issue that most colonists disliked, most humans dislike even today. So now we are going to see how the American Revolution influenced the French Revolution, and how the French Revolution also influenced the Haitian Revolution. So something that we ought to note is that Haiti was the first independent Western country, gaining independence in 1804, even though the Haitian Revolution actually begins in 1891. So some dates to keep in mind: the American Revolution in 1776, 13 years later, the French Revolution, 2 years later, the Haitian Revolution, even though that took a while. And the reason that the Haitian Revolution took a while to actually be complete was what was going on in France. Now, you will remember that Haiti, whose name was Saint Domingue, was controlled by the French. In fact, it was the most productive French colony. It is said to have accounted for about 60% of world coffee production and about 50% of sugar production. So you can clearly see it was a very lucrative colony. At the same time, it had a very interesting population dynamic. So about 500,000 Haitians, even though they probably weren't called that, were enslaved Africans. 30,000 were free French, so white French, and another 30,000 were mulattoes. Now, this whole list of who a mulatto, Zambo, Pardo was, but for the most part, mulattoes were considered people who had mixed parentage of West African and European heritage. And so let's see what was going on in Paris, France, where the French Revolution was beginning to. Now, the circumstances for the French Revolution. Again, we talked about the 7 Years' War. We said we are not going to know very much about it because it's not really relevant to what we're talking about. 1758 to 1763. The British eventually come out victorious. They kick the French out of very many places, including India. We'll talk about that. North America. And so Louis kind of wanted revenge. Louis the 16th was the French king, even though he was actually pretty young. He died at maybe age 27 in 1793. So, but let's just say the French kind of wanted revenge, and the French supported the U.S. with money, with arms. We talked about George Washington defeating Cornwallis with the help of de Rochambeau, who was the French naval commander. And so wars cost money. You have to then pay for the loans that you have borrowed. And so this becomes one of the critical phases of the French Revolution. And so 1783, the American colonies win against the British with the help of the French. But then the French loans that they had borrowed were coming due. So, but there were also a lot of these countries had taken on colonies, and these colonies were not really very productive. So, there were these sort of think of it as a slow recession, and so the king, because again, think about the difference between. Actually, maybe there isn't such a big difference. For example, when the U.S. went to war in 2001, nobody really asked the citizens if the US should go to war. Uh, the president decided. 2 years later, he decided to go to war against another power. And so you can sort of see this happening in the 1700s. So the French king, nobody asked, well, Americans, of course, were looking for allies, but the French were only too willing to help. Um, and so the Frenchmen were like, but we didn't really want a war, so why were we in a war? Um, and now we have all these debts and we have to pay. So, of course, one of the ways to pay debts is to increase taxes. And the citizens kind of really didn't want to pay increased taxes. But also, the king lived very lavishly. Um, Maintenance of palaces and so on, and expenditure. Yeah, that was a lot of. And so, from about 1781 to 1788, the French monarchy was really not solvent. They didn't have money, and the recourse was to tax people more. At some point, if you tax people too much, they will revolt. Now, in 1788, the French king decides to call. So the French had a parliament, which they called the National Assembly. They still call it the National Assembly. Um, and so the king calls the National Assembly together in Paris, so that they can figure out a new way of reforms that would bring about more money. And so the French, so sort of think about the social classes. There were three classes which were called the Estates General, but each of them had its characteristics. So, for example, most of the clergy were in the first estate, the aristocrats were in the second estate, and the commoners were in the third class. Um, I don't know that we have an equivalent today, but because the clergy really isn't such an important class today. But so these were the three classes, the estates general. Um, for reference, the clergy numbered about 10,000. The aristocrats were about 200,000, and the commoners were about 25 million. So clearly, you can see the commoners were the majority. But when the National Assembly met, most of who were there were the clergy and aristocrats. So clearly, it wasn't a very equal society. And this was part of what commoners were unhappy about because, but again, if you sort of think about how history repeats itself, think about who sits in the Congress of the United States. Um, yeah, there's not a lot of equality there either. So the king calls the estates general to come and discuss reforms, including repayment of the debts. And so the people's representatives, the French representatives are generally called the deputies, met to decide what they were going to do. And during this time, you actually see a lot of discussions about philosophy, about who should rule. Now, again, you will remember, for example, individuals like John Locke had already discussed that the king was not, appointed by God. He wasn't absolute, that the people should decide um, who rules over them, those kinds of things. And so you'll see these discussions of the general will, the good of all, thinking about um, the social contract. So what is it that binds people to their government? These are the things that the philosophers are discussing. Now, so this is actually, so they're infusing the debates that are ongoing with their own commentary, with what they think ought to be the considerations among the people. So, for example, in the rights of man, which actually had a lot of input from Rousseau, the French are arguing that the law is the expression of the general will, that people agree to be ruled. So it's a contract between them and their rulers. That all citizens, so the law must be the same for all people, that all citizens are equal. So you see, they don't even suggest that citizens should be equal. They say all citizens being equal, um, equally admissible to all public dignities, employments, and so on. Now, part of this was a dig at the king, because the king had decided to start selling offices of nobility. So that was one of the ways he raised money, which is kind of crazy if you sort of think about it. But these are, I think, ideas that are fundamental to how people are governed. In fact, if you look at the US Declaration of Independence and the French rights of man and of the citizen, you will see a lot of similarities. This language of equality, of all citizens being equal, of so those kinds of things. They you see them a lot. Now, there wasn't a consensus. There was actually disagreement over one, who should be the representative of the French people. Again, here the clergy and the aristocrats disagree. They especially with the commoners. The commoners argue that if truly it is the will of the people, then they should have more representatives because there are many. Um, 25,000 versus 200,000 versus 25 million, no, actually 10,000 versus 200,000 versus. So the commoners decide that the National Assembly isn't doing a great job, and so they actually set themselves aside, and they are going to come up with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And so they actually went to, next to the National Assembly were sports facilities, so they took what was called the tennis court oath. It really is a creation of the new constitution for France. But generally, we see a bit of rioting. So this is 1789, around July. Um, and so citizens are unhappy. There were many other reasons for this. For example, there was a lot of famine going around, and he is a king wanting to charge more taxes. So citizens are like, maybe this should not. So anyway, this becomes a riot, and Louis the 16th is asking whether this is a revolt, and one of his actually La Rochefoucauld is the person who's in charge of the Paris metro, and he says, no, sir, it's not. Protest, it's a revolution. And so this is, there were no pictures then, photos, but this is an artist's rendition of the storming of the Bastille. Now, the Bastille was a big prison that was used to jail people who disagreed with the regime. So if you had some opinions that the king didn't like, yeah, you were imprisoned at the Bastille. So the storming of the Bastille is the emblem of the French Revolution, even though there were like 99 people in the Bastille, including one person who had actually insulted the king. Maybe it was Voltaire. Um, so there was, it was an emblem of these excesses that the French monarchy was. Now, so the revolution begins in France officially on Bastille Day, which is July 14th, 1789, which is what the French celebrate as the official Independence Day. So again, you see the US celebrates the 4th of July, the French celebrate Bastille Day on the 14th. A few years ago, there was a president who wanted to do a parade like the French do. The French bring out their military. They have a whole thing going with the Bastille Day. But so that is the beginning of the French Revolution. The French Revolution culminates with a couple of things. One of them is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. So this is kind of the a, a bit of that. And so you can sort of see the similarity between this and the US Declaration of Independence. Men are born and remain equal before the law, freedom of speech, press, and religion, right to take part in government, right to hold public office, right for a fair trial. So the US ones are kind of distributed differently, but you can sort of see the language of the Declaration of Independence, but also the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, press, religion, um, and right to hold public office, right to a fair trial, which is in the sixth and seventh, um, fair, speedy trial, those kinds of things. So the French Revolution is well on its way. And so these are some of the things so the French Revolution occurs in three phases. The French are very interesting because they didn't just toss out the king. There's discussions about what is the format of the French Revolution. Is it going to be straight up, do away with the king? But again, remember that France was a very heavily Catholic nation, including today. And so the Pope had some significant influence, but also this is 1780s. People were not about to become completely secular. So the French Revolution proceeds in three phases. The first phase is what is called the constitutional monarchy. So the French decide we are still going to have a king, but he is going to be subjected to the laws of parliament. Um, if you have a king or a monarch who is subject to the laws of the land, then that is usually a constitutional monarchy. An example of that is Britain. Britain has a king. Now they actually have a king, but the king really doesn't do anything. Like, I don't even know what the king does other than be king. Um, Belgium has a king. I think was it the Belgian? Maybe it's the Netherlands, where the queen abdicated and her son is supposed to take over. But these are constitutional, like the constitution is the supreme court of the law of the land. Now, this is unlike other countries like Saudi Arabia, which has a sultan who is actually the head of government, runs the government. So, constitutional monarchy, there's a king, but parliament is the supreme lawgiver. And so, this is what they settle for. But none of these, so the king could not levy taxes or declare war without consent of the parliament. But this did not solve the immediate problems, like there was a famine still going on. And this is actually where you see the Women's March from Paris to Versailles. And so actually they were going to take their grievances to the king about taxation and other things. So the constitutional monarchy is established. The Catholic Church is subjected to civil law. Again, the church was above the law. So this was a change. And the constitutional monarchy also drafts the unequal tax. Now, at the end of the constitutional monarchy, we find that the Republicans, and this will be the second phase of the revolution. So, Republicans are people who believe that a country should be governed by a constitution. Her was an Austrian princess married to a French prince who became king. And so the Prussians, the Austrians told the French, if you kill the queen, we are going to war. You can kill your own king, we do not care, but if you kill the queen, we are. Eventually, so the Prussians and Austrians were in cahoots. We'll talk about Prussia, Germany, Austria, and how they were all sort of the same thing. But so eventually, the radical Republicans. Now, the key here is radical. Yeah, radical. Let's kill the king and queen, and because this whole constitutional regime is not working, let's just get rid of them and rule the country. And so when the king and queen discovered they were about to be killed, they decided to flee to Varennes, which is towards the east, so towards Germany. And they were actually arrested and returned to Paris. So the king is deposed. They hold a new election. They decide they are going to kill the king, and so actually, Louis the XVI is executed for treason in January, maybe 1792, and Marie Antoinette eventually is executed in September of the same year. Now, the so this begins the phase that we call the radical republicanism, and it was radical. It wasn't just radical; it was nearly crazy. Um, but it's sort of like the people who aspire to being ruled through the constitution. These are the ones who are in charge. But the highest authority was what was called the Committee on Public Safety, that was led by Maximilien Robespierre. Um, Many historians call this a reign of terror. The reign of terror because, for the most part, there was only one crime, and so like if you said something, you are accused of treason. If you did something the radical Republicans didn't like, you are accused of treason, and there was only one punishment for treason, which was being executed. And they didn't just execute you; they used the guillotine, which was invented in 1791. Now, I don't know if you have pictures of the guillotine. There was one um, positive thing about the radical republicanism phase. Now, the radical Republicans used the constitution to if because they sort of talk about equality of all men, and they did not distinguish that men were land owning people, so everybody was in theory free, including people who are enslaved in French territories, which includes Haiti. So actually, in 1791 and 1792, um, the Vincent Auguste, who was at the time in France when the revolution was happening, goes back to Haiti and starts a revolution. Now, that didn't go very well for him. He actually was executed in 1791, I believe. But this is the first instance of the revolution in Haiti. By 1793, slavery is being abolished by the radical Republicans, and so Haiti becomes independent. Haiti actually makes very weird choices with freedom, um, because they thought, okay, now who is going to work the fields if everyone is free? So the mulattoes who were in charge, including, for example, Dessalines and Louverture, were like, maybe we should re-enslave some people, which is not to be, yeah. Louverture especially was. So let's go back to France for a minute. Radical republicanism, Maximilien Robespierre, reign of terror, about 30,000 people are killed, this one crime. Um, yeah. They also introduced what was called the cult of the supreme being. It kind of was a little weird, and I don't necessarily expect you to understand the precepts of the cult of the supreme being, but we want to look at it as you're moving away from religion, so it's sort of like anti-religion, that the individual is the highest being, so you're the supreme being. There's a God, but it was then they changed the week, so they had 10-day weeks. Yeah, like 7 days isn't long enough. They changed the years, so 1791 becomes year one, 1794 becomes year one, and then they changed the names of the months. So, for example, July becomes Thermidor. Yeah, some things that yeah. Anyway, so this is Marie Antoinette on the right, and yeah, and Louis the 16th. Yeah, there was a whole drama about them and child marriage and at 14. And so this is apparently the guillotine and the execution of Louis the 16th in January 1793 during the radical republicanism phase. They had a weird way of so the guillotine would come down and then they would hold up the head, and those Frenchmen, yeah, see. Uh, Now, if you remember, we talked about the Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that abolishes cruel and unusual punishment. This is one of those. Um, yeah, the French are a little strange. They abolished the use of the guillotine in 1976. So, yeah, not too long ago. History is yeah. So the cult of the supreme being, some of the precepts, including, for example, immortality of the soul. So instead of recognizing God, they recognized a supreme being, but also the person had an immortal soul. Yeah. So school of thought, cult of reason, and so this was actually counter atheism. So they didn't want to just get rid of religion or Catholicism and go straight to no religion, because some people had started doing atheism, and so they're like, yeah, we do not like Catholicism, we do not like atheism, so we are going to go into the cult of the supreme being, existence of God, immortality of the human soul, civic-minded public virtue, and virtue attained through active fidelity to liberty and democracy. So it's some, yeah. This is Maximilien Robespierre, at least what they think he looked like. And so, yeah, these are the tenets of the. So, cult of the supreme being is thought of as a deism. So, believe in some religious order. Now, Karma knew where Maximilian lived. There's a different way to say this, but so after killing 30,000 people, the French are like, did we trade one tyrant for another? And so Maximilien Robespierre was also accused of treason. And so he was arrested in July 1794. He actually attempted to flee. Um, he was captured, and then where he was held, he attempted to commit suicide by shooting himself. He did not die, so he actually was patched up and prepared for, he was guillotined, like he had done with so many other people. So, yeah, I guess that happened to him. And not sure he was very pleased with it. Now, so the third phase of the revolution, remember three phases: radical republic, constitutional monarchy, radical republicanism, and the consolidation. So the consolidation is what actually brings Napoleon Bonaparte to power. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte was actually not really. So there was, after the end of Robespierre, after he was killed, there was a what was called the Directory, which was like a committee of like five people who were running France now. And some of the changes that they did was they said, well, this whole cult of the supreme being, this Thermidor, this new month, this new weeks, this is too much. We should go back to maybe some sort of order. And so they begin going back to the pre constitutional monarchy days. So they are going to recognize the Catholic Catholicism and the Catholic religion, but they're still going to subject Catholicism to the civil law, but they are going to maybe, regularize things the way they were before all the craziness. And so there's five people who are ruling, but Napoleon's job was to like go out and reconstitute the military and go fight some people, including professionalizing the army. which he does, and then he wins a couple of wars against Austria and a whole bunch of other places. He's then going to start the Napoleonic Wars, so it's sort of like that's also not what we tried to do. Um, and so he fights quite a number of foreign wars. Now, during the 7 Years' War, so let's go back to like 40 years before. During the 7 Years' War, you remember that the French lost North America, but they also lost India. And so now they're like, oh, now we are strong again and we still have grudges. And so we want to go and defeat the British, all kinds of places. So they actually go and defeat the British in Egypt in 1798, even though eventually the British will take over Egypt. But Napoleon does quite a bit of fighting and wins, including um, he was the only person besides the Mongols to ever conquer Moscow. But there's a whole story there. But so he's a military leader. He is winning. He actually defeats quite a lot of other